We live in a world of constant change. Daily advancements in technology are assumed. Economies go boom and bust overnight. Population levels around the world expand by the minute. And war seems to be an all too familiar part of the evening news. You wonder what life will be like in the future, and if there will even be a future. The Bible says that this world has a use-by date. But it's not all bad news, for beyond tomorrow there's a promise of hope. There are two major forces in society that directly affect each one of us: politics and economics. Of course, it's not just our local environments. We're buffeted around by the bigger players in the global community. Markets around the world get edgy whenever there's a run on Wall Street. Perhaps of equal significance has been the political readjustment in Europe with the proposed forming of the European Community. If successful, this federation of European states will potentially not only create history, but radically change our world.
This is the headquarters of the European Union, where attempts are being made to unite Europe through a federation of states. The European Union came into existence in November 1993 in the Dutch city of Maastricht. It's no surprise that many of the historic attempts to unite Europe have been motivated by the desire to bring unity to the region. Today, through the efforts of the European Union, this focus has considerably broadened. The Maastricht Treaty established three pillars which would underpin the new Europe: a common currency, a common foreign and security policy, and a common justice and internal policy. Member States also acknowledged that to fulfil its mission, the European Commission must open itself to Eastern countries. Through the efforts of the European Union and the European Commission, the momentum for unity continues to grow. Strangely enough, this is nothing new. It's been around for centuries. Millions have even fought and died over it, and large fortunes have been invested in trying to achieve it. But the question is, to what extent can it ever become a reality?
Together with the fall of communism, the potential development of a single European nation constitutes the biggest political change of the 20th century. But when it comes to the unification of Europe, such an outcome has already been predicted. It has been said that the predictions made by the Jewish prophet Daniel almost 2,500 years ago appear to make Nostradamus and other so-called prophets look like amateur weather forecasters. But how could a Jewish slave living in 600 BC have anything meaningful to say about the 20th century, let alone European unification? It all comes down to the issue of credibility. Was the biblical book that bears Daniel's name actually written by him in 600 BC, or was it just an elaborately constructed hoax?
Well, about half of Daniel is written in Aramaic. Now, what some people have argued is that the kind of Aramaic in which Daniel is written shows that it could not have been written in the 6th century, but must have been written in the 2nd century because of the kind of Aramaic that it is. And that was held by quite a number of people for some time, but now that we know more about Aramaic, it's become clear that the Aramaic of Daniel is no strong argument for a late date, that the language could well have been used by somebody writing in the 6th century.
The book of Daniel is supposed to have been written in the ancient city of Babylon. In 612 BC, King Nabopolassar of Babylon rebelled against his Assyrian masters, destroyed Nineveh, defeated Egypt, and founded the new Babylonian Empire. The Babylonian army commander was the youthful crown prince Nebuchadnezzar. Marching west and south, he conquered all of Syria and Palestine before learning that King Nabopolassar had died. Leaving the army to bring home the captives, Nebuchadnezzar made an epic journey across the Arabian desert to claim his throne. The young King Nebuchadnezzar attacked Jerusalem in 605 BC. Thousands of Jews were taken hostage and deported to Babylon, some 2,000 kilometers to the east. Daniel was one of them.
We have the so-called Babylonian Chronicle. This is an account of Nebuchadnezzar's campaigns towards the west. We know of several campaigns of Nebuchadnezzar towards the west. The first one in 605, but he did not accomplish much at that time because his father had died and he had to move back in order to receive the kingdom. But after that, he returned, and it was apparently at that time that he first had contact with Jerusalem, and that Daniel and his friends might have been taken to Babylon. But then he returned in 597 and 596, and then the Babylonian Chronicle breaks off. We don't have the account of the actual destruction of the city of Jerusalem in 587. We have only there the biblical record.
Daniel started out in Babylon as a slave, but soon began his climb up the ladder in the civil service. He eventually reached the position of personal advisor to the king. But what really caught Nebuchadnezzar's attention involved a strange sequence of events.
In the second year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His mind was troubled and he could not sleep. So the king summoned the magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers to tell him what he had dreamed. When they came in and stood before the king, he said to them, "I have had a dream that troubles me, and I want to know what it means."
The court astrologers were accustomed to standing by the royal bedside to tell the king whether he was going to have a good or a bad day. But on this occasion, the wise men had nothing to go on, so they begged the king for more information. The king demanded that the astrologers tell him both his dream and its meaning. But of course they couldn't. So he ordered that all the phony wise men be executed. Daniel, who was one of them, heard about what had happened and asked the king if he could have a little more time. He knew he couldn't solve this problem on his own.
Then Daniel went to his house and made the decision known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, that they might seek mercies from the God of heaven concerning this secret, so that Daniel and his companions might not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon.
Daniel knew God would be interested in the problem and that there is no crisis that he can't solve. That night, God revealed to Daniel the same dream the king had, as well as its meaning. Next morning, Daniel hurried to tell the king. He did not hold back on the source of his information. "O king, there is a God in heaven," he began, and then described what he had seen. King Nebuchadnezzar immediately recognized the dream. He had seen a multi-metal statue of a man.
The head of the statue was made of pure gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of baked clay.
Daniel explained that God had given this dream to the king to reveal the future. Like any monarch, Nebuchadnezzar wanted his empire to last forever and his family to rule over Babylon for eternity. So he was delighted to hear Daniel say that the head of gold represented himself.
You are that head of gold.
From the monuments and inscriptions which archaeologists have discovered, the ancient people of Babylon not only had an antiquity rivaling that of ancient Egypt, but extended over Palestine, Armenia, Elam, and even to Arabia. And the city of Babylon was magnificent.
Today we know that the outer wall was 27 kilometers large, about 16 to 18 miles, and the top was wide enough to have chariots driving around on top of the city, so to speak. And of course there were Ishtar gates, one Ishtar gate actually, the processional way from which the king moved to the temple. We have about 53 temples in Babylon, channels, parks, palaces, and the well-known gardens of Semiramis. And then we have about one big temple tower, so that the whole city actually was a very impressive sight when people moved from the desert, which was very flat, towards Babylon.
Naturally, the king was disappointed to learn that his kingdom would not last forever. And Daniel's next words probably gave him nightmares for the following week.
After you, another kingdom will arise, inferior to yours.
Nebuchadnezzar probably took cold comfort from the news that Babylon would be succeeded by an inferior kingdom. It was not the sort of prediction to be made lightly, for Nebuchadnezzar's empire had not yet reached its height. But this did not faze Daniel. Evidence of the conquest of Babylon has been found in the excavations of the city.
We have no destruction layers in archaeology of the burning of the city or of any destruction. So the record that we find with Herodotus and also Josephus, the ancient historians, is that they say that the Persian troops diverted part of the river, of the Euphrates River, so that the level of the river was lowered and they could move into the water gates into the city. And this apparently might have happened because there is no destruction of the city. And when Cyrus moved in, he did not destroy the city. In fact, he kept up all the important palaces and buildings in order to use them.
Daniel's prophecy proved correct. The next world empire belonged to the Medes and Persians, represented by the breasts and arms of silver. Medo-Persia ruled over 127 provinces. Its capital was at Persepolis, a treasure city in the Persian desert built by King Darius. The palace was entered via a grand stairway. At the top of the stairs is the platform on which the palace was built. The entry through the gateway of all nations was guarded by 15-metre high winged bulls. Built on a large platform at the base of a mountain, the palace was the treasure house of ancient Persia. Persia was a kingdom of silver. Never as powerful as Babylon, the Persians used silver as a medium of exchange. And during their rule, silver was first minted into coins. But the Medo-Persian kingdom wouldn't last either.
Next, a third kingdom, one of bronze, will rule over the whole earth.
History has also proved this prediction accurate. The conquest of Alexander the Great established a Greek empire that covered the then known world.
Well, of course, Alexander was a terrifically brilliant fellow. He won all his battles. He was personally very brave. Once, when his men were having trouble getting over a city wall, they had the ladder up and they couldn't get down inside, and he was impatient with them, he climbed up the ladder himself, though he was their top general, and said, "Come on, men, let's get on with it." He jumped off the wall inside the building and was immediately overpowered. He had his back to the wall, was fighting bravely, and he was wounded. But now his men who were battering at the city gates get the word that their leader is in there. His life is at stake. And they battered down those walls now with zeal and got in there and rescued their general.
Alexander became king at the age of 20 and inherited a united Greek kingdom. It included Athens, the cultural and spiritual home for the Greeks. On the Acropolis in the centre of the city were the temples. The Parthenon was built of marble, using optical illusions to produce its perfect proportions. The temple honoured Athena, the goddess of war and patron goddess of the city. Below the Acropolis was the Agora, the central business district of Athens. Corinth was another important city-state, situated on a narrow neck of land connecting the Peloponnese Peninsula to the mainland. Ships unloaded their cargoes to be carried overland and reloaded on the other side in order to avoid the dangerous sea voyage around the peninsula. Corinth's centre of worship was the temple of Apollo, the sun god. To the north was the city of Thessalonica. Here Alexander gathered a huge army to fight the Persians. He assembled philosophers, geographers, scientists and diplomats to accompany his army and set out on this epic journey of conquest. Waiting for him at the river Granicus was Darius III of Persia. In the battle that followed, Alexander's bronze armoured warriors put the Persians to rout.
Alexander was actually a young man when he died, I think around 30 years of age. And he left a huge empire, actually, reaching from Europe all the way to India, Far East, so to speak. And when he left, his death was sudden. We don't know whether he was murdered or whether he died by a malaria type of disease, but he had no successor. So the generals that were accompanying him, they divided the country, the big, huge empire actually, amongst themselves.
But Nebuchadnezzar's dream wasn't yet complete. Daniel predicted yet another world empire.
Finally, there will be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron. For iron breaks and smashes everything, and as iron breaks things to pieces, so it will crush and break all the others.
The first of the Greek kingdoms fell to the Romans in 168 BC at the Battle of Pydna. 140 years later, all of the then known world formed the Roman Empire. This empire stretched further than any other, from Hadrian's Wall on the border of Scotland, through Europe, North Africa and the Mediterranean, down to Asia Minor, Palestine, Egypt and the lands of the East. It lasted longer than all the previous world empires before it, until about 476 AD. All roads led to Rome, the capital. From the time of Julius Caesar, the heart of the city was the Forum. Here was the Temple of Saturn and the Curia where the Roman Senate met. Through the Forum ran the Sacred Way, down which conquering emperors and generals rode in triumph. Overlooking the Forum is the Palatine Hill, which has given us the English word palace. The Roman emperors lived here. During the reign of Augustus Caesar, Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Tiberius, the next emperor, appointed Pontius Pilate as the governor in Jerusalem at the time of Jesus' death. At one end of the Forum is the Arch of Titus, erected to commemorate his victory at Jerusalem in 70 AD. Inside is the famous relief, showing the seven-branched candlestick from the temple being carried in triumph through the streets of Rome. Nearby is the Colosseum, the amphitheatre built by Jewish slaves brought to Rome after the destruction of Jerusalem. It seated 80,000 spectators who watched the gladiators fight and kill wild animals. It's been suggested that the Colosseum was also used as a place of execution for Christians who were torn apart by lions. In the Circus Maximus, Christians were impaled on stakes, covered with tar and set alight as torches, while the Emperor Nero drove his chariot around the racecourse. These Christians were buried in more than 1,000 kilometres of tunnels under the city of Rome, now known as the Catacombs. The Roman Empire was characterised by iron, the strongest metal known in ancient times.
Unlike the previous empires, Rome was not overrun by another one. Instead, it was divided into many small countries.
Whereas you saw the feet and toes partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided. Yet the strength of the iron shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with ceramic clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly fragile.
The legs of iron would not be succeeded by another, a fifth ruling power, but would be divided. The Romans would no more remain united any more than iron mixes with clay. The mystery is, how could the imperial might of Rome just crumble into bits and pieces? Rome fell apart when its work ethic was lost, and crime, immorality and corruption became the norm. Thus weakened, the vast Roman Empire was attacked by the barbarian tribes from the north. Attila the Hun and others led raids that splintered the Roman Empire. Eventually, Rome was divided up into independent kingdoms that later became the nations of Europe. 10 major tribes, in addition to much smaller groups, carved up Europe exactly as Bible prophecy had said would happen. To this day, these nations have remained divided, separate, but adjacent, just like the toes of the foot. Let's look at the toes of Nebuchadnezzar's image representing divided Europe. The Roman Empire was divided between 351 and 476 AD as the barbarian tribes invaded.
As you saw iron mixed with ceramic clay, they will mingle with the seed of men. But they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay.
When you get the fall of the Roman Empire, there's another power, really, the papal power, which is able to move in because civil governments collapse there. Then you get the first attempt, I suppose, to reunite East and West from the barbarians with Justinian coming over from Constantinople, but that doesn't last long. Then I suppose you come to the Charles V, who's looked upon as the one who sought to unite Europe. And you don't get very much attempt at unification again until you come to Napoleon. He is able to spread himself right from the English Channel to Moscow at one time. But of course, after Waterloo, the old rulers are put back on their thrones and Napoleon's work collapses completely. Then I suppose the last of them was Adolf Hitler, who dreamed of the Third Reich that will last 1,000 years. He may have been thinking of the millennium, if you like. It lasted, in fact, from 1933 to 45.
At the end of World War I, the League of Nations was formed in Switzerland to endeavour to bring unity to Europe and the world, but it failed. The United Nations eventually replaced the League with its headquarters based in New York. But what of its success? Our TV screens are regularly filled with scenes from some new war zone or other. We don't really know what will happen in Europe in the future, and to what extent agreement will be found on the issue of unity. But one thing is for sure. The prophet Daniel predicted little hope of a fully united Europe.
So, what of the future? King Nebuchadnezzar dreamed of a stone cut out of the mountain without human hands that smashed the statue, grinding its metals to powder. In turn, the stone became a great mountain which filled the whole earth. Given that the prophecy has proved to be highly accurate so far, we can be fairly certain that this event will happen one day. But to what event does it refer? Some have suggested that this rock cut out of the mountain without hands represents the return of Jesus when he comes to earth the second time to establish his kingdom. One thing is sure, we're not living in the era illustrated by the head of gold, the breasts and arms of silver, the thighs of brass, or even the legs of iron. We're living down just before the rock smites the image, just before the final kingdom is set up. If this refers to God's kingdom, there will be no suffering, sickness, or death. It will be a place where no home is shattered by divorce, where there are no stillborn babies, where pollution won't fill the air. It will be a new kingdom where peace and harmony exist and where Jesus will reign.
For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of an archangel and with the trumpet of God. And the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And thus we shall always be with the Lord.
How do we prepare for that coming? Being ready means having a relationship with God now, by trusting his power to solve the problems of this world, past, present, and future. In many ways, our relationship with God is similar to a marriage relationship. A man and a woman commit themselves to each other without condition. They don't know what the future holds for them, but they love each other and they trust each other. So they promise to take each other, to have and to hold from this day forward. For better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish till death us do part. If humans can place such trust in other humans, how much more reasonable is it to commit to the creator of this world and the one who will someday renew it? You know, history is not merely the record of the rise and fall of nations. God has always been and remains in control, and he invites all to be ready to become part of his kingdom. The Bible tells us of a time where the heavens will be ablaze with the glory of his second coming to this earth. 10,000 times 10,000 angels will accompany him. Jesus will embrace each one of us, take us by the hand and say, welcome home. Now, that's what I call hope.